For centuries, the story of the Persians seemed almost too simple. They built one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever seen, spoke a language connected to the wider Indo-Iranian world, and ruled a territory stretching across much of Asia and the Near East. Because of that, one popular explanation imagined the Persians as outsiders who arrived on the Iranian Plateau, brought a new language and culture, and eventually replaced much of the population that had lived there before. But when scientists began looking at ancient DNA, that simple picture started to fall apart. The genetic evidence was pointing towards something much older, deeper, and far more complicated. The people who eventually became the Persians were not simply newcomers. Their ancestry was already connected to the Iranian Plateau thousands of years before the Persian Empire existed. And that immediately creates a much bigger mystery. If the Persians were not simply a population that arrived and replaced everyone before them, then how much of the ancient population actually survived into Persian times? How much ancestry came from people who had lived in the Zagros and across the Iranian Plateau for thousands of years? And how much came from populations moving into the region from the Caucasus, Central Asia, Mesopotamia, and beyond? These questions matter because political history and population history are not the same thing. An empire can rise in a few generations, while the genetic identity of a population can take thousands of years to form. The Persian Empire may have appeared suddenly in historical records, but the people standing behind that empire had a much older story. The Iranian Plateau was one of the greatest crossroads of the ancient world. To the west was Mesopotamia and Anatolia. To the north were the Caucasus and the Caspian region. To the east stretched Central Asia and the routes leading toward South Asia, while the Persian Gulf opened the southern part of the region to another network of movement and trade. For thousands of years, people traveled through these landscapes. Farmers expanded into new areas. Pastoralists moved across mountain corridors. Merchants connected distant settlements, and armies carried people from one region to another. Some groups mixed with their neighbors, some remained relatively isolated, and others disappeared as distinct communities while leaving descendants behind. The result was not one clean genetic line, but layers of ancestry accumulating across thousands of years. Long before anyone used the word Persian, the Iranian Plateau was already home to farming communities with their own distinctive genetic histories. The Zagros Mountains were particularly important. Early farming populations developed there thousands of years ago, and ancient DNA shows that these early Iranian farmers were genetically different from some of the early farming populations farther west in Anatolia and the Levant. This is one of the deepest pieces of the Persian ancestry puzzle. The Iranian Plateau was not simply a destination where later populations arrived. It was already a major center of human settlement, adaptation, and population development. The people who lived there long before the Persian Empire became part of the ancestry that later populations inherited. But the story did not remain isolated. As the Bronze Age developed, the Iranian Plateau became increasingly connected to surrounding regions. Trade routes expanded, technologies moved, and communities that had once been separated by mountains and deserts began interacting more frequently. Genetic evidence shows that populations related to ancient Iranian groups contributed ancestry to populations far beyond Iran, including populations connected with Central and South Asia. This does not mean that ancient Indians or Central Asians were simply Persian, because the Persian identity belonged to a much later historical period. Instead, it reveals that the populations living across Eurasia were connected long before modern countries or ethnic labels existed. This is where the story becomes easy to misunderstand. When scientists identify ancestry related to ancient Iranian populations, they are not saying that the people involved were ancient Persians. Genetic relationships can be much older than historical identities. A population can contribute ancestry to another population thousands of years before either group develops the language, culture, or political identity that we recognize today. So when we talk about Persian genetic origins, we have to travel much farther back than the Persian Empire itself. The real story begins with prehistoric populations of the Iranian Plateau, and then follows the movements, mixtures, and transformations that happened afterward. Language adds another layer of complexity. Persian belongs to the Iranian branch of the Indo-Iranian languages, which itself belongs to the larger Indo-European language family. This linguistic connection links Persian historically with languages spread across Central and South Asia. But language and genetics do not always move together. A relatively small population can introduce a language that is later adopted by a much larger local population. Political elites can spread language and administrative systems. Trade networks can spread vocabulary. Cultural prestige can encourage communities to adopt a new language without replacing their entire ancestry. That means the presence of an Iranian language does not automatically mean that the entire population arrived from somewhere else. The same principle becomes important when scientists examine steppe-related ancestry. Bronze Age populations associated with the Eurasian steppe expanded into different parts of Eurasia, leaving genetic traces in many later populations. But those movements did not affect every region in exactly the same way. Different populations received different amounts of steppe-related ancestry, and the timing of those movements varied. The Iranian Plateau did not experience one simple replacement event. Instead, different communities interacted with incoming populations at different times and in different places. Some ancestry entered the region, some remained local, and over generations, the boundaries between populations became increasingly complicated. By the time Iranian-speaking peoples became historically important, the Iranian Plateau already contained a very old population history. Groups associated with the Medes and Persians emerged within this landscape rather than appearing on an empty map. The Medes became powerful in western Iran, while the Persians became especially important in the region of Fars in southwestern Iran. Then, in the 6th century BCE, Cyrus the Great began building what would become one of the most powerful empires the ancient world had ever seen. But the rise of the Achaemenid Empire does not mean that a completely new population suddenly replaced the people who were already there. The Achaemenid Empire expanded across an enormous territory containing millions of people from many different backgrounds. Mesopotamians, Egyptians, Anatolians, Levantine populations, Central Asians, Greeks, and many other communities became part of the empire. This was not a Persian population spreading into empty territory. It was a political system incorporating populations that already had their own histories. Soldiers traveled, administrators moved, merchants crossed imperial routes, families settled in new regions. Over generations, these movements created opportunities for genetic mixing. Yet the people living in the Persian heartland did not simply disappear. This is one of the most important lessons from ancient DNA. Political conquest can happen very quickly, but genetic replacement is much harder. An army can take a city in a matter of days, but that does not mean the population of that city disappears. A dynasty can fall in a single generation, but families can remain in the same region for centuries. A language can become dominant without completely replacing the ancestry of the people who adopt it. The Persian Empire, therefore, needs to be understood as a political and cultural transformation taking place on top of an already ancient population landscape. Recent ancient DNA research makes this point especially interesting. A 2025 study examined ancient samples from multiple archaeological sites across Iran, including individuals associated with the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanid periods. The researchers found evidence of substantial genetic continuity in parts of the northern Iranian plateau over thousands of years, while also identifying connections with populations farther east and west. The historical individuals did not form a completely separate genetic population that suddenly appeared during the Persian Imperial period. Instead, they were connected to older regional ancestry, while also reflecting the broader movements that had been shaping the Iranian plateau for centuries. Imagine a family living in the same region for hundreds of years. Then a new empire arrives. The government changes, the army changes, the official language changes, and new administrators appear, but the family remains. Their children grow up in the same landscape, marry people from nearby communities, and pass their ancestry forward. A few centuries later, the political system may be completely different again, but part of that original ancestry can still be present. This is the kind of continuity that genetic research can reveal, even when written history focuses almost entirely on kings and empires. The Parthian period adds another layer to the story. After the Achaemenid Empire and the Macedonian conquest associated with Alexander, Iranian political power eventually returned in the form of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians controlled enormous territories connecting Iran with Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and the wider Silk Road world. People continued moving across these networks. Yet the genetic evidence does not suggest that every political transformation produced a complete population replacement. Instead, the Iranian Plateau remained a place where older ancestry persisted while new influences entered. The Sassanid Empire continued this pattern. Beginning in the 3rd century CE, the Sassanids established another powerful Iranian state and revived Persian imperial traditions. They fought Rome and Byzantium, controlled important trade routes, and built a sophisticated political system. But genetically, the people of the Sassanid world were not created from nothing. Ancient DNA from Iranian archaeological sites shows historical individuals connected to the broader genetic landscape of the Iranian plateau. The empire was politically new, but the population history beneath it was much older. This is why the question, where did the Persians come from, may actually be the wrong question. If by Persians we mean the people who became historically associated with the Persian language and Persian political identity, their story is deeply connected to southwestern Iran and the wider Iranian plateau. But if we go backward thousands of years, we encounter populations that cannot accurately be called Persian at all. Their ancestry contributed to later populations, but their identities were different. The Persian story is therefore not a single origin point. It is a long timeline of ancestry, migration, interaction, and cultural transformation. This is where the DNA tells a very different story from the simplest versions of history. It does not show a clean replacement of an ancient population by a completely foreign people. It shows continuity mixed with movement. Ancient Iranian ancestry survived, while new ancestry entered from surrounding regions. Some groups remained relatively isolated. Others became heavily connected to their neighbors. Over time, these different layers became part of the genetic landscape of the populations living in Iran. The Iranian Plateau was also connected to South Asia in ways that reach back thousands of years before the Persian Empire. Ancient populations related to early Iranian farmers contributed ancestry to later populations farther east. This does not mean that modern South Asians are descended from ancient Persians. That would be historically and genetically incorrect. Instead, it shows that ancient populations across Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and South Asia were connected through much older population movements. The same ancient Iranian-related ancestry that became part of later Iranian populations also became one component of the genetic history of populations farther east. This is one reason the Iranian Plateau is so important in the broader history of Eurasia. It was not just the home of Persia, it was a bridge between different worlds. Human populations moved through it for thousands of years, and their genetic histories became intertwined. Some movements were probably small and gradual. Others may have involved larger population expansions. Some left strong genetic signals, while others disappeared almost completely. Ancient DNA allows scientists to begin separating these different layers. But modern Persians cannot be reduced to one ancient genetic population. Modern Iran contains enormous genetic diversity. Persian-speaking populations live alongside Kurds, Lurs, Balak, Gaylaks, Mazandaranis, Arabs, Azeris, Turkmen, and many other communities. Their histories overlap, but they are not identical. Geography helped preserve some regional differences. Mountain ranges isolated certain communities, while plains and trade routes encouraged greater interaction. That means there is no single Iranian DNA or one genetic sequence that identifies every Persian person. Instead, scientists look for patterns of shared ancestry. They compare ancient genomes with one another and with modern populations. They ask which populations are genetically closer, which ancestry components are shared, and when those relationships are likely to have formed. The result is not a simple label like Persian or non-Persian. It is a reconstruction of population history, and that reconstruction increasingly points toward a combination of deep regional ancestry and repeated outside contact. This also makes the idea of a pure Persian bloodline scientifically misleading. Ancient DNA does not support the idea that Persian ancestry remained genetically isolated from the rest of Eurasia. The Iranian Plateau was simply too connected for that to happen. But genetic mixture does not mean that ancient ancestry disappeared. In fact, the evidence suggests the opposite. Older Iranian ancestry survived, while new ancestry was gradually added to the population. That may be the most fascinating part of the story. The Persian genetic history is both ancient and mixed. Those two things are not contradictions. A population can remain in a region for thousands of years while continuously exchanging genes with neighboring populations. Continuity does not require isolation. In fact, the Iranian Plateau appears to demonstrate exactly how a population can preserve deep roots while remaining connected to a constantly changing world. Think about the number of political transformations Iran experienced. The Achaemenids rose and fell. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire. The Seleucids ruled parts of the region. The Parthians established another Iranian empire. The Sassanids followed. Then the Arab conquest transformed the political and religious landscape. Later came Turkic dynasties, Mongol invasions, Timurid rule, and many other changes. If every political transformation had completely replaced the population, modern Iranian ancestry would look radically different. Instead, genetic evidence shows that older ancestry persisted through many of these transformations. The same pattern can be seen when we consider culture. After the Sassanid Empire fell, Persian culture did not disappear. The Persian language continued to develop and eventually became one of the major literary languages of the Islamic world. New dynasties adopted Persian cultural traditions. Persian literature spread far beyond modern Iran. Yet this enormous cultural influence did not require complete genetic expansion of Persian people. Culture can travel farther than genes. That distinction is critical. A language can spread without a mass migration. A religion can spread without replacing the population. A political identity can become dominant without changing the ancestry of everyone who adopts it. The Persian world is an excellent example of how these different processes can happen at the same time. The cultural influence of Persia became enormous, while the genetic history of Iranian populations remained rooted in a much older and more complicated landscape. So, what exactly did scientists discover? They did not find one mysterious population hiding behind Persian history. They found evidence that the people associated with later Persian civilization were connected to a much older population history on the Iranian Plateau. They also found evidence of genetic connections extending into neighboring regions. The result is not one clean origin story. It is a layered history in which ancient Iranian ancestry survived, while new ancestry entered through thousands of years of interaction. The 2025 ancient DNA research is particularly valuable because it provides a longer timeline. Instead of studying one isolated individual, researchers can begin comparing individuals from different archaeological periods. Copper Age populations can be compared with Bronze Age populations. Iron Age individuals can be compared with historical Persians. Achaemenid samples can be compared with Parthian and Sassanid individuals. Each new genome becomes another point in the history of the population. And the more points scientists have, the easier it becomes to see continuity and change. They can ask whether an ancestry component becomes more common during a particular period. They can investigate whether a new population appears suddenly or gradually. They can compare different regions and determine whether a genetic change was local or widespread. This is how the simple question of Persian origins becomes a much larger scientific investigation into population history. But there is an important limitation. Ancient DNA is still rare in Iran. Hot climates, environmental conditions, and the age of the remains can make genetic preservation extremely difficult. Archaeological samples also cannot represent every person who lived in ancient Iran. A cemetery may represent one community, one social group, or one particular period, so scientists have to be cautious about turning a limited sample into a statement about every Persian who ever lived. That means the most responsible conclusion is not that scientists have discovered the exact DNA of the Persians. They have not. Instead, they are reconstructing a population history from increasingly powerful evidence, and that evidence is pointing toward deep continuity combined with repeated migration and interaction. This is actually more fascinating than a simple origin story, because it means the Persian identity was built on top of a much older human landscape. The people who lived in the Zagros before the Persian Empire did not know that their descendants would one day be called Persian. They did not know Cyrus would build an empire. They did not know Persepolis would become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world. But some of their descendants may have carried pieces of their ancestry into those later societies. Imagine standing at Persepolis at the height of the Achaemenid Empire. Delegations from across the known world arrive. The reliefs show people from different lands bringing gifts to the Persian king. The empire looks enormous and new, but beneath that imperial world was a population history already thousands of years old. Some of the people living in that world descended from local communities whose ancestors had inhabited the Iranian Plateau long before the Achaemenids existed. That is the hidden timeline DNA can reveal. The empire may have been new, the ancestry was not. And this is why political history and genetic history must be studied together. History tells us when a kingdom rose, who ruled it, and where its armies went. Genetics can tell us what happened to the people underneath those political changes. Sometimes the two stories match. Sometimes they do not. And when they do not, DNA can force historians to reconsider assumptions that once seemed obvious. The Persian case appears to be one of those stories. The people did not simply appear when the empire appeared. They were already there. They were already connected to ancient populations of the Iranian Plateau. They already carried ancestry shaped by thousands of years of interaction. And then, over time, a new political and cultural identity emerged. That identity became Persian, but the ancestry underneath it remained much older. This also helps explain why modern Iranian populations can contain both deep local ancestry and genetic connections to distant regions. The Iranian Plateau was never an isolated island. It was a crossroads. The same geography that made Iran strategically important to ancient empires also made it a place where human populations interacted for thousands of years. And perhaps that is the real answer to the mystery. The Persians were not simply one ancient tribe. They were the result of a long process. Ancient Iranian populations formed one foundation. Later populations entered from neighboring regions. Bronze Age movements connected Iran with Central and South Asia. Iranian languages spread. Political identities developed. Empires expanded. Populations mixed. And through all of it, some of the oldest ancestry remained. The story, therefore, cannot be reduced to the Persians came from here. It is closer to saying that Persian ancestry was built gradually across a landscape that had been occupied for thousands of years. And the deeper scientists look, the more complicated the picture becomes. There are still major gaps in the genetic record. Entire regions of Iran remain poorly sampled. Some historical periods have only a handful of ancient genomes. There are communities whose ancestors may have played important roles in Iranian history, but whose DNA has not yet been recovered. Every new genome has the potential to add another piece to the puzzle. One future discovery could reveal a previously unknown migration route. Another could show that a population thought to be isolated was connected to Central Asia. Another could reveal that an ancestry component appeared much earlier than scientists currently believe. And perhaps the most exciting possibility is that researchers will eventually recover enough ancient DNA to trace population changes across Iran almost generation by generation. That is why the story is not finished. Ancient DNA has already changed how scientists think about Persian origins, but the evidence is still growing. And perhaps the most important lesson is that the old choice between indigenous and foreign is too simple. Persian ancestry can be deeply rooted in the Iranian Plateau. while also containing ancestry introduced from outside. Those two facts can both be true. A population does not have to be isolated to have continuity. The people of Iran could remain connected to their ancient ancestors, while also becoming genetically connected to neighboring populations. That is how most human populations actually work. Human history is not a series of sealed boxes. It is a network. A family moves, a community expands, a language spreads. A marriage connects two regions. An empire moves soldiers. A merchant settles in a foreign city. A population absorbs newcomers. And after hundreds of generations, all of those events become part of the same genetic story. The Persians are no exception. Their story simply happens to be unusually well documented because the civilization they created left such an enormous mark on history. We remember the kings. We remember the palaces. We remember the wars. We remember Persepolis. But DNA reminds us of something history books often overlook: ordinary people. The farmers who lived in the Zagros, the families who stayed in their villages while empires changed around them, the travelers who crossed the plateau, the people who married into neighboring communities, the children who inherited ancestry from both sides. Those people created the genetic foundation on which later Persian civilization developed. And some part of that ancestry may still exist in people living in Iran today. The empire disappeared. The political borders changed. The rulers changed. The official religions changed. The languages evolved. But human ancestry can survive all of that. That may be the most surprising thing DNA has revealed. The Persian story is not the story of a single bloodline. It is the story of survival. It is the story of continuity mixed with movement. It is the story of an ancient population landscape repeatedly transformed by new people, new languages, new cultures, and new empires. And perhaps that is why the genetic origins of the Persians are so difficult to simplify. The story begins before Persia. It continues through the Achaemenids. It survives the Parthians and Sassanids. It passes through the Islamic transformation of Iran. It continues through centuries of migration and political change. And it eventually reaches the modern populations of Iran. So when we ask where the Persians came from, perhaps we should not look for one place on a map. We should look at a timeline stretching back thousands of years, a timeline filled with ancient farmers, mountain communities, traders, pastoralists, migrants, conquerors, and families. And somewhere along that timeline, the identity we now call Persian began to emerge, not as a sudden replacement, not as a single migration, but as the result of thousands of years of human history. The DNA did not reveal that the Persians came from one unexpected place. It revealed something far more interesting. The foundations of Persian ancestry were already ancient when the Persian Empire appeared. And while new populations continued to enter the region, much of the older genetic story survived underneath them. That means the real mystery may not be where the Persians came from. The real mystery may be how much of the ancient Iranian population survived long enough to become Persian. And as scientists recover more ancient DNA from the Iranian Plateau, that question may eventually become answerable. Because every ancient skeleton carries more than a date. It carries a possibility that somewhere inside its genome is a connection to a population we thought had disappeared. A connection to a migration we never knew happened. Or perhaps a connection to people who never left at all. And if future discoveries continue to show the same pattern, then the story of Persia may become one of the clearest examples of something that happens again and again throughout human history. Empires can change almost overnight. Cultures can transform within centuries. Languages can spread across continents. But ancestry moves differently. It survives quietly, generation after generation, sometimes changing, sometimes mixing, sometimes disappearing, and sometimes remaining recognizable thousands of years later. That is what makes the Persian DNA story so extraordinary. The empire was temporary. The people were not. The kings disappeared. The ancestry continued. And the deeper scientists look, the older the story becomes. So perhaps the next time you hear about the Persian Empire, don't imagine only Cyrus, Darius, Persepolis, and the armies that once crossed the ancient world. Imagine the people who came before them. Imagine the communities living in the Iranian Plateau thousands of years earlier. Imagine the genetic connections stretching towards Central Asia, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and South Asia. And then imagine all of those layers continuing forward until they become part of the populations living in Iran today. Because the story of Persian ancestry was never as simple as a single origin. It was built over thousands of years, and the DNA is finally allowing scientists to read some of those forgotten chapters. But one question remains. If scientists continue recovering ancient genomes from Iran, will the next discovery prove that even more of the people who lived on the Iranian Plateau thousands of years ago survived genetically into the Persian world? Or will it uncover an ancient migration that completely changes what we think we know about the origins of the Persians? That may be the next secret hidden inside the DNA.